I'm here at the Forest Grove Cemetery. Came over to see Edwin C. Burleigh's burial site, and I figured while I'm here I might as well tell you a little bit about him because he's pretty fantastic. He was an ex-governor. This whole area is dedicated to him and his family. I'm in this kind of cordoned off area that literally is only for him and his family. There aren't that many of these here in Forest Grove Cemetery, and this one is pretty comprehensive. Has a lot of family members buried in it, but I'm going to show you where he and his wife are buried right now, and then I'm going to show you, and then I'm going to explain some things about Edwin that I think you should know. So here's his burial site. Alright, so this is the monument that's dedicated to him. He's buried on the left over here, and his wife is buried on the right over here. His family is inside. Look at all these trees that are lining up. I don't know if you can see them, but there's a fence of trees all around this big area. All around bushes, they're like shrubs, little shrubs and trees. And it's been paved with these stones, and it goes all around. Someone took great care to make sure that this got put together right, and I'm gonna tell you why in a couple minutes. He was a very impressive. The fact that he has this is really, I mean, it's a testament to how the state saw him and the legacy that he left behind with his kids, his surviving kids, and their surviving kids. The Burleighs, well, Edwin was amazing. Can't wait to tell you about him. So I'm going to sit down at this bench here, which is actually dedicated to him, his family. Can you see it? It says Burleigh on it. Alright, so let me put this down. I'm going to put this on my tripod, then I'm going to get out my notes to help me along to remember all of the things that Edwin C. Burleigh did for this state. It's just very impressive. Here we go. Okay, here are the 10 things I think you should know about Edwin C. Burleigh. The first is that he owned vast amounts of timberland. He grew up in the wilds of the Maine woods. Without the Maine woods, his family probably would not have survived their first winter up there. So to say that he had an intimate relationship with the woods and everything that it provided for him and his family would just be an understatement. So when he grew up and he came into the position of being able to purchase timberlands for himself, he did that. He purchased large amounts of timberland and then leased them out to companies, corporations throughout his lifetime, and it provided a steady income for his family above all of the other things that he was involved in business-wise. To say that he was connected to the Maine woods in a way that the average Mainer was not is also an understatement. And so when he entered into the political sphere and earned himself different positions of authority and influence, he used that authority and influence to protect these wildlands. And two of the things that he did was, the first was he asked the legislature to pass a law that made creating forest fires a crime. And it didn't matter if you did it on purpose, by negligence, or accident, it didn't matter. If you started a forest fire, you were responsible for that forest fire. Okay? The second thing was he got rid of the title of Maine State Land Agent. Maine State Land Agent was a title that a lot of men, during his lifetime, it was all men in politics, a lot of men kind of bounced off of this position in Maine government, the Maine State Land Agent, on their way to hitting, like, you know, working in the legislature and then being a governor and then going off to Washington, D.C. A lot of them held this position as Maine State Land Agent, and he was no exception. He held it for 3 years himself. Okay, so he got rid of the Maine State Land Agent title and he replaced it with the Forest Commissioner, the title of Forest Commissioner. The Forest Commissioner was responsible for the oversight of wardens that were put under his supervision, and each of these wardens would go out to the different areas that they were responsible for and then report back to the Forest Commissioner. So this was a system that Edwin C. Burleigh put into place. The second thing I think you should know about Edwin C. Burleigh is that he was heavily invested in the Bangor and Aroostook Railroad. His brother was one of the heads of the railroad company, and he had this grand vision of laying track from Houlton to Brownville. And if you look on a Maine map and you see where Houlton is and you see where Brownville is, you realize you are in the middle of nowhere. Back then anyway. Here, Houlton, in today's time, Houlton, you know, it's a city that everybody pretty much knows about, but it's still very tiny. Albert, his brother Albert, wanted to lay track from Houlton to Brownville to open up maybe some business opportunities up in that area, among other, and to bring in population, because there was barely anybody up there. I mean, the Burleigh family was known as a founding member of a founding family of Aroostook County, not just Linneus, but literally the county. So there wasn't the county. I mean, the state of Maine's like this big, and the county's like this big. I mean, that's a very vast area to have not that many people in. The problem was that Albert couldn't get the investors he couldn't get the amount of investment from investors needed to lay the track, and so he had to come up with a plan. His plan was called the Burleigh scheme. So the Burleigh scheme, what the Burleigh scheme did was it challenged the state. It asked the state, hey, if I can get each town to pay for half of the cost of the track being laid from the town before them to their town, will you, the state, please match that so that we can get this track laid, because the investment is a sound one. And not everybody was on board. Not a lot of people were on board. It was literally asking the state to have everybody in the state pay for track being laid in these areas of Maine that really didn't have any people. So Portland, Augusta, maybe even Waterville at the time, Lewiston, you know, these people were thinking, why should my taxes go pay for something in a place that I'm never going to go, because who would go up there? And what am I going to see for investments come, you know, what's the payback for us down here, really, right? But Edwin, this is the third thing I want you to know about him. Edwin owned the Kennebec Journal, okay? And he used the Kennebec Journal to start spreading the word about the benefits of having a railroad running from Houlton to Brownville. And he used the newspaper, he got the word out, and he kept pushing the word out, and eventually the state legislature did find value in this plan and agreed to it. And so the railroad was laid, the track was laid from Houlton and bounced off all these little towns almost to the very end. It did not get to the very end. The plan wasn't going to go through, and Lord only knows how this was going to affect the whole scheme of things. And so Albert went to his brother Edwin and to his father Parker Prescott and asked them, will you please invest with me so that I can finish this track? I know it'll pay off. And I'm not sure how much arm twisting it took. I don't think it took any at all, because Parker Prescott raised these boys to depend on each other and to support each other. So Albert and Edwin were like this their entire lives. When Albert asked, Edwin believed in him, and they both invested along with Parker, who was in his twilight, well into his twilight years by this point. They invested all of their savings, all of their life savings into this railroad company, into this dream, into this plan. And at the time, we're talking well over $2.5 million. You know, in the late to 1890s, maybe early 1900s. That's a lot of money. It makes your heart skip a beat to think about how much money that is back then. I mean, $2.5 million now is a big deal. $2.5 million then was holy cow. But it worked out. Everything worked out. The fourth thing I'd like you to know about Edwin C. Burleigh is that he advocated with his newspaper, again, for improving the conditions at the Maine Insane Asylum. I'm not calling it the Maine Insane Asylum. That's what they called it back then. It's been called many, many things. I grew up calling it AMHI, which is the Augusta Mental Health Institute, but they called it the Maine State Hospital at certain times, the Maine Insane Asylum at certain times. Anyway, it was overcrowding, and the facility was maxed in every way imaginable. There were too many people. I mean, imagine people pouring out of these buildings. There were just too many people. It almost became like a dumping ground. People couldn't get the services that they needed. Let's just say this facility, I don't know the specific numbers, but let's just say this facility is set up for, say, 600 patients, and you've got 1,800 or 2,000 patients there. Not only are they not getting the therapy that they need, because there's, instead of one therapist being responsible for 15 or 20 people, now you've got one therapist responsible for 60 or 90 people. How effective is this going to be for the people who need treatment? Not very. The buildings are only equipped to handle so much sewer usage, so much water usage. They can only feed so many people. They only have so many beds for so many people. And then when people need to be congregating in areas, I mean, did they have fire codes back then? I mean, think about the disaster that this is, and it went on and on and on for years. So this facility was beyond maxed for many years. It was so far over capacity, it would be considered inhumane to have that many people in one area. But the thing is, this was the only place the entire state could send their mentally ill. This was the only place. So all the people from the highly populated south sent them to Augusta. All the people from the sparsely populated north sent them to Augusta. I mean, we're talking about just a huge population of mentally ill individuals all sent to the same place and not getting the attention that they needed. And he had enough of it. He had his newspaper here in Augusta. It reached everywhere in the state, and he said nobody else is speaking up for these people, so he did. He used his newspaper, which that is prime real estate. There's no radio at that time. There's no television at that time. I don't know what other, there's no internet, definitely no internet, no telephones. The newspaper is prime real estate. He used his newspaper to let the state of Maine know we need to do something about this. And when he became governor, it's one of the very first things that he did. He created a commission to get out there and go find somewhere in the state of Maine where we can build another one of these hospitals. And they actually did find a place in Bangor called we call it now the Bangor Mental Health Institute. I believe it's a Dorothea Dix Psychiatric unit or something like that. But that whole plan was, he actually put this commission in place when he was governor. And while it wasn't finalized while he was governor, there were just two snags. Pretty much the whole thing was planned out perfectly except for the two snags. And one of the snags was when it came time to sign the check, the legislature said, we are not giving you $200,000 for this, which was interesting because after he left the governor's seat and they haggled and haggled and tried to haggle some more, they wound up having to sign a check for $250,000. And I believe the original location, which they were ready to break ground on, they realized they could not break ground on because there was something structural about the ground that was a very minor inconvenience. I think they put it down the road and across the street. Like literally, they kept it in the same general area. So the fifth thing that I think you should know about Governor Burleigh is that when he was elected to the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C., one of the first things he did was in lieu of this disaster that was happening at the Maine Insane Asylum in Augusta, right here in Augusta on the Kennebec River, he went to the House of Representatives and addressed the committee that he needed to address, and he said, we are in dire need of housing for our mental health patients, and we have this arsenal complex that's sitting right beside the hospital that's overflowing with patients. We've got this major crisis going on there, and if we could just have these buildings, we could move them over to these buildings, and it would really reduce the stress that's being put on the buildings that they're in right now. And we could expand some of our programs. And he fought hard for it, but he didn't have to fight too hard. He actually asked them to ask the Secretary of War, can you please sign these buildings over from the federal government to the state government, and we'll take care of them from there. The House of Representatives signed it like that, said yes, you can have these buildings. I mean, he put in a really great argument. The House of Representatives had no problems. They signed it. You can have them. They sent it up to Congress. Congress took one look at it and said no problem. And they were literally unanimous in the House and unanimous in the Senate. They signed them, gone. And we got those buildings really quickly. They refitted a couple of the buildings right away, and one of them was a really large building. They moved 135 patients to that building fairly quickly, right after they fixed it up and made it habitable for the patients, and they called it the Burleigh Pavilion. The sixth thing I think you should know about Edwin C. Burleigh is that he acquired $140,000 in appropriations to build the Haut Lighthouse in Down East Maine. Mainers know it probably more commonly as the Robinson Point Lighthouse. But he actually did have to fight for this a little bit. He sat in front of the committee and was asking for the money, and there were a bunch of people that already knew about this, and they had already known had already known the character of Edwin Burleigh. They knew that if he was asking for it, that it wasn't a flippant request, that we needed it. But there were a couple who challenged him, and they asked him, they said, why do you want this lighthouse? Is it because there's rich people that want to have a place to dock their yachts safely and they don't know how to get there without a light from a lighthouse? Because we don't really have money for that. And he said, no. He said, you know, I tried to get this request in last year. He said, I put the request in and someone let me know later on that I had missed the deadline. I would have asked you last year. I mean, it's really dire that these fishermen out in this area have been asking for this for years. And he said, enough attention hasn't been brought to it, but I'm here to do that now. The fishermen are requesting this because the coast is very rocky. The weather up there is very unpredictable, so the water gets choppy. And you might go out with calm water, and then within hours it's so choppy. It's hard to bring your boat in safely, and it gets foggy out there like that. Like it's very dangerous. So many boats have been lost. Fishermen have died. It's just the conditions out there, especially in the wintertime when it's dark far later in the morning and far earlier at night, you know, the daylight's not as long. And so the fishermen, their days are cut short because they're afraid for their lives to go out too early, and they're afraid for their lives to come in too late at night. So he was asking for appropriations for a lighthouse that could be a fog warning system and also a lighthouse. He did meet a tiny bit of resistance, but really the resistance came in the form of, why don't you bring me facts and figures so that we can, you know, work with these facts and figures? Because really all he had was anecdotes at the time. Took him no time at all. He went right back to his office, got all of the information that they requested, got it to them as soon as possible, and they signed off on it. And so he's the reason why we have the Robinson Point Lighthouse, or the Isle of Haut Lighthouse. The seventh thing I think you should know about Edwin C. Burleigh is that he's the reason why Camp Keys is a central muster point for the state of Maine militia, the Maine National Guard. When he was a young man, he left college, went to be a teacher, taught for a short period of time, learned about the surveying that I told you about earlier. He learned about the surveying opportunities. He did that for a while, and then the Civil War broke out. He and his brother Albert were all about helping out the Union in the Civil War, and they weren't just like token soldiers. They wanted to go fight, and Edwin specifically wanted to go fight to free black slaves. This is why he wanted to join the war. He wanted to make himself a soldier for the benefit of people who were being oppressed. This is a theme. He's not playing around. This isn't something he's doing for political prowess or whatever it is, or political positioning. He's doing this because he believes in advocating for people who no one else is listening to. So he and his brother learned about the war starting, and they raced. They couldn't get on the road fast enough, came right down to Augusta to take their physicals and to get their sign off so that they could go off and join the Washington, D.C. cavalry. The only thing is, he didn't pass his physical. He didn't pass. His brother did pass, and his brother did go off to war, but Edwin did not, and he was very upset. He was distraught over it. So he started knocking on doors and asking people, like, what can I do to help out with the war effort? Because I really want to help the Union, you know, triumph over the South. And it was just great luck, because he wound up working in the Adjutant General's office during the duration of the Civil War. The Adjutant General is in charge of the Maine militia. The Adjutant General's office is the place where they, you know, it's like the central point that all that information comes in, like different troops need different supplies, or, you know, mail to and from, or where are we sending people out, or, you know, I don't even know. It's just like, everything you can imagine about war comes through this office. So he was a clerk in that office, meaning he had a very intimate experience with all of the ins and outs of what it takes to be at war, right? So when he got elected to positions of authority, he had this in his mind. He had personal experience with this. He wasn't at war. I'll tell you a little bit about being at war. His brother was at war. His brother got shot twice. He took either shrapnel or a bullet to the shoulder, but it wasn't really a serious injury. It didn't keep him down, but he did get shot in the shoulder. But he caught a musket ball in his thigh, and this wrecked him. He was actually taken as a prisoner of war shortly thereafter, and he was kept in a tobacco warehouse for an extended period of time. Albert was not a small man. Okay, I'm gonna just put it that way. I'm not sure how tall he was and how big he was, but he was a lumberman. Like, he was an outdoors man, so he was a big strapping guy. When he emerged from that situation as a prisoner of war, he weighed less than 100 pounds. This is what he gave to the war. And Edwin was nothing but jealous, you know? Like, he just really wanted to be a part of it. And so he took his passion for what he had done for the war and he just carried it with him. So when he actually was elected to, as governor, as an example, one of the first things he had on his mind was creating a central muster point for the entire state of Maine. And what he did was he took $3,500 and he purchased Camp Keys. Camp Keys is literally, we're sitting in the memorial for Governor Burleigh at the top of Forest Grove Cemetery. Forest Grove Cemetery is on a hill, so it kind of has like tiers, you know, and okay, so we're at the top part right now. Camp Keys is literally on the other side of these bushes. Okay, I'm right here in front of the Burleigh bench that I was just sitting on earlier. I'm going to show you where Camp Keys is. It's right there. I don't know if you can see the fencing right there. I'll come out here and show it to you. It's right there. It's right across the street. That's one of the buildings. I mean, it goes quite a ways down that way, and it extends. The airport's on this building here. There's all kinds of other buildings in there. It extends out, and they park some trucks, a whole bunch of big trucks against the fence, and then there's a major road on the other side of the fence, and then there's the airport. So really, it's an excellent location. But anyway. This is Camp Keys, and this is where Edwin Burleigh is buried. So I imagine at some point there wasn't anybody buried between him and Camp Keys, right here, and that his monument could see one of the most outstanding purchases that he made during his time as governor. Camp Keys was a thorn in his side when he first bought this land here that Camp Keys is on, because the state of Maine was not happy with him buying this land. He took so much flack for this when he first bought it, it was ridiculous. I mean, you would have thought it would have ended his political career. However, a few short years later, every bit of real estate in this area more than tripled in value, and suddenly he was a hero. So it was a really wise decision to buy this piece of land and to have every militia unit know that in the whole state that this is a central muster point for, you know, future wars. He also, I gotta get my thinking right, he also made improvements to the Maine National Guard, as well as he increased veterans benefits from $75,000 to $135,000 for the veterans that had come back from war. Specifically in his mind, I believe he was addressing the Civil War veterans that he saw come back from war, because there were some injuries. There were a ton of injuries. People were coming back, soldiers were coming back with injuries that were lifelong injuries. These injuries would never remedy themselves, and these soldiers would need assistance for the rest of their lives, and $75,000 was not going to do it. So he almost doubled what they already had allotted to them. The eighth thing I think you should know about Edwin C. Burleigh is that he's the reason why Augusta is still the capital of Maine and Portland is not. Apparently there was a really huge push for the capital of Maine to be moved down to Portland, because that's where all the people were. There were a lot of people in Augusta, but there were way more people in Portland. There are a lot of people in Augusta now, but there are way more people in Portland. But Augusta is central, and he found value in it staying here. We already had the Capitol building at the time, and it was just already settled that Augusta was the capital, so he put a kibosh on it. He just stopped it. And in the process of doing that, he saved the state of Maine $2 million, while at the same time expanding the Capitol building and keeping Maine at its lowest tax rate in Maine's history. The 10th thing that I would like you to know about Edwin C. Burleigh, the 10th thing, is probably the one that's closest to my heart, and it's probably one of the reasons why I admire this man so much. I've told you all of the advantages that he had at his disposal. He owned timberland. He owned a huge stake in a railroad company, you know. He was a governor. He was a representative in the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. He was a senator. He could have anything he wanted. He owned the Kennebec Journal. I mean, he was a monster of a man. He could have been your worst nightmare, but he wasn't. He wasn't. He was our biggest ally, the state of Maine. He was an ally, an unparalleled ally. So far as my research has gone, I've researched a few of these governors that have been buried here in this cemetery, and Edwin C. Burleigh has, there's nobody that even comes close to him in terms of his being an ally to the state of Maine. So I'm not sure if I already said this, but I'm going to say it again if I did. What he put his heart into, none of it was flippant. He was very passionate about everything that he cared about. And to put into perspective how sentimental he was about the people in his life and about the experiences in his life. I mean, I already told you he had sentimentality about all kinds of experiences. You know, about protecting Maine the wildlands, the woodlands. He grew up in those woodlands. He didn't forget that. When he came into a position of authority, he protected those woodlands 2 times over at a minimum, right? And he bought woodlands to me, and he made sure that he protected those woodlands. He was willing to go to war, to die for people he had never met, just so that they could have their freedom, so they could live their life as free as he was living his own. You know, he used his newspaper as a voice for people in the Maine insane asylum who no one was listening to them. No one was listening to the people who were trying to advocate for them. He waited until he had the position and the authority to do so, and then he used it until something was done about it. Okay, so this was his passion. His father died. Parker Prescott Burleigh died and left the home to the boys, and Edwin wound up taking care of it. And he wasn't up there in Linneus. He was down here in Augusta, but he was not going to let his house, his childhood home, with all of his memories of his mother and his father and his brother, and and just his whole, he loved his childhood, he loved his life, he loved his life in Linneus. He wasn't going to let this house just be sold to somebody else. He kept it in the family, and he hired a handyman to live in the house and to upkeep the house so that he could go back anytime he wanted and really, lose himself in his childhood home. This is the kind of man he was. He was sentimental about the things that were his. So, keeping that all into perspective, let me tell you a little bit about his wife. His love for his wife was, of course, unparalleled, as you might expect. His wife, he and his wife moved to Washington, D.C. when he became a representative, and he was a representative for 13 years, and then he actually took a seat in the Senate for his last 3 years. So the last 4 years that he was in Washington, D.C., the first of those last 4 years, his wife got sick. So she was sick for about 2 years. She was ambulatory and still able to participate in social life and whatever her husband had going on, kind of, for those 2 years. It was kind of touch and go, but at least she could fend for herself and take care of herself to a degree, and she could still get around. The last 2 years, this was not true. She was very sick. She was bedridden for the last 2 years, and she finally died on May 12th, 1916, and while he was still a U.S. Senator. It kind of shocked people in a way. It was more like a devastation thing than anything, and he was absolutely devastated. People were really, upset for him, for the loss for him, and of course for her. But she was sick for 2 years. It's not like they didn't see it coming, but nobody wanted it to happen. He settled his business in DC temporarily, brought his wife's body back to Augusta, Maine. He moved in with his son Louis. His house was not too far from the cemetery, and he took care of his, everything to do with his wife and getting her into her final resting place. And then he passed away weeks after she did, of a brief illness. And to say that his brief illness came on suddenly would be an understatement. It was an absolute shock to people that he passed. And in the memorials that were given to him and to his wife, because they died so close together, some of them were given to him and his wife, it was generally understood by everybody who knew him. I mean, if you could read take a minute and research the memorials for Edwin C. Burleigh, they will break your heart. I mean, he was loved by so many people. He gave passion, and that passion was reflected back to him. He was just, people loved him. And when they wrote them the memorials, their memorials to him, it was just generally understood that he died of a broken heart. He loved his wife so much that after she passed, he waited to make sure that everything was set for her, and then he died. I mean, the character of this man runs so deep. It's unparalleled. It's unparalleled. This memorial here with his family surrounding him, this is incredible, and it's meaningful on so many different levels. I invite you to do your own research on Edwin C. Burleigh, because he's worth it. He really is. And a lot of the things that he put into place during his time as governor from 1889 to 1893 are still here in 2022. We embrace them. They're a part of our culture here in Maine. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'm off to do some more research for another guy down over the hill, but yeah. Alright, till next time, everyone.